Okay, thank you. Hey, all right, good afternoon, as it is now. And let's key up the show. And you hear me okay? Or can you just hear me like this? We're such a small group. All right, I'll try to keep this going. And so I was asked today just to give you sort of a general overview of bats and their situation, their ecological perils, and why we should care about them, and why they matter, and some of the nice and interesting things about them. So let's see if this is going to work. All right, first off, bats, we call them the group of mammals to which they belong, we say Chiroptera. And Chiroptera means hand, wing. So the chiro part there is hand, and the ptero part is wing. And that's because the bat wings are made out of the same parts as you have. So if you look at the analogous parts of our hand, the bats have fully retained all of the fingers in there. And in a bird and in the previous vertebrate mode of flight here, pterodactyls, the fingers are reduced, and you just have left a simple membrane. And in birds, this, of course, is just actually dead biological material, scales, modified, which are feathers or modified scales. But in the bat, we've got all of the finger bones are left here. And this is living tissue, and you can hold up the wing, and you can see the vascularization in there. In fact, has been used for studies on circulation and vascularization, because you can actually peer through and see an intact working circulation network. But what the bats have, because this is living tissue, it's also a fully instrumented manipulative flight surface. So there's tiny little hairs on there. They can actually feel the air moving over the wing and manipulate it and fly in ways and manners that birds can't. And much more maneuverable. And that's way, just if you see a silhouette of a flying bird or a bat, you can often tell the bat, because the bat's making all the quick little turns that birds can't do. So where do they all fit in? Well, there's this sort of colloquial notion that bats are mice with wings, and actually mice are way up here, rodents, distant offshoot. And if you go up the family tree with us, that bats are over here, and they're actually much more closely related to ourselves and a much more complex brain and vision system and socialization systems and reproductive ways, much more like ourselves. And I'll show you some of those examples of that. Overall, there's about 1,200 species of bats across the world, and 1 out of every 4 or 5 mammals on this planet is a bat. And that often comes as a surprise to people, because we don't generally encounter them and recognize how numerous they are and how important they are throughout the world. And they play essential ecosystem services and roles everywhere they are on the planet, except for the one continent, Antarctica, where you can't find them. But half of all the extant bats are in some moderate or serious decline. And that matters, and because they uphold many special systems. So yeah, instead of mice with wings, how about turtles with wings? And this is actually because when I did my graduate work, I did it in a turtle lab, and I brought bats in the lab to learn some of the physiology. So I managed to convince my major advisor that this was a real animal to get my role. Now, if we make the comparison to mouse, mice and bats, yeah, they are similar insofar as they're both cute little warm fuzzy creatures. But that's about where the similarities end. If you think about mice, if you have a pair of mice and you give them everything they need, all the resources they need, at the end of the year, how many mice are you going to have? A lot, yeah, that's the basic answer. Because a mouse will have a litter, and then within 5 to 8 weeks, those litters become sexually productive and can start having litters then after gestation. And so litters upon litters upon litters by the end of the year, if you have all the resources. And the conservation and management consequence of that follows that if you have a large decline in a population of a rodent population, they can bounce back and rebound very quickly. And that's simply not the case with bats, because bats will have, let's go, there we go. Bats will have just a single pup in any one year, and occasionally twins, again, just like humans. And so our conservation strategies have to be anticipatory, not come in after something happens to make it better. because of this very slow reproductive rate. If you've got a substantial catastrophe or something that happens to a population of bats, it can take very, very long time, human generation scale, to recover, if at all. And so we sort of have to try to anticipate what's happening and manage them before those things happen. And that entails us understanding their needs and where they fit in and what they do. But what they make up for in low reproductive rate is longevity. So bats will live 30, 40 years. The record band recovery now is at I think it's about 42 years in a European species. And so it's quite remarkable for small little animals like that to live quite so long. And again, maybe this might help you to feel a little more warm and fuzzy about these animals rather than, and much more like humans here in terms of little pups that need requirements and care. And so, yeah, these are orphan fruit bats being managed and taken care of. And another interesting part about bats is this is actually below a stairway at the back of Hearst Castle. And what you find here are two different species. Maybe, you can see these darker ones here are free-tailed bats, same ones that roost over here in the library and Jolly Green. And these are pallid bats. And these are actually two different species that are roosting together at what we call a night roost here. And so they tend to get along. And even though they are both going after insects, all the different species have different strategies of foraging, and so they tend to share and get along rather well compared to a lot of other what you would consider predatory animals. So this is one of the reasons why this matters, and we can actually pick up on and assess the economic importance of bats. That recent estimates worked out that bats save farmers $23 billion a year in the ecological services that they render through consuming insects and insect pests. And you probably have all noticed that insects are a lot more abundant at night, and that's because daytime is a hostile time for insects. They're small, they evaporate, they lose their moisture quickly in the sun, and at night they go out, it's safer, and bats have been able to tap into that resource, and they're very effective at it. There's a single colony in Texas that you can estimate the amount of insects they consume per night to be 100 tons of insects a night. And when you know how much an individual insect weighs, you can know that's a lot. Yeah, that's a colony of 10 to 20 million bats doing that work for you. So, and what do they do? Well, another really important part is all of the major tropical rainforests depend upon bats for either seed dispersal or pollination. And so not just our own bats and their benefits, but throughout the world, they perform these services. And this is one of our bats that we get up here. Yeah, is that better? All right, thanks. This is one of our bats down in Arizona, and this is a nectar feeding bat, and these are vitally important for the pollination services that they do. And you can see the little tongue out there is ready to come out and do its pollination bit that they do. And so for all of these dominant, the Sonoran Desert plants, the yuccas and the saguaros and all, they all depend upon bats. And no bats, no tequila. So for many people, that's it right there. That's, I don't have to argue any further to convince them. All right, and there are remarkable stories of bats and plants, and there's a whole field called Chiropterophily, which are flowers that are adapted to bats and specific bats for pollination. And this is one a colleague just discovered just recently, several years ago. And if you look at how long this flower is and the nectar is down there, how do you suppose the bat is getting the nectar out of that far down? It brings a straw. No. Actually, it's a very, very long tongue. And so that tongue is longer than the bat's body here. And it actually has a specialized anatomy that the tongue is actually anchored down here in its sternum rather than the back of your head, as in most of us. Yeah. Well, you can try it, but... So this is, these bats are only in tropical America. And the interesting thing about them is why you don't see them elsewhere. If you think of the African savanna, this would be an ideal niche for bats to occupy. And we don't have that. So what I want you to notice here is that the stealthy mode that they use, they actually land some distance from their prey, not always me, and they stealthily approach their predators. And then their face has specializations to sense where the warmth, which is where the blood is closest to the surface, and then that's where they just make a simple little incision. And okay, if you're awake, you can feel it. Yeah, you see how they're getting along? Okay, now, this looks, I guess it's October. It's a good month for this. But there are benefits from this. So we have learned there's 3 components in vampire bat saliva to keep the blood flowing. There's an anticoagulant, that makes sense, and that's been tested for human use. There is a clot buster. So if any clots form, they break up. And that's under clinical trials now, for example, for stroke remedies. And there's also a vasodilator. So that's the real kicker, is that one of your common wound responses are for your blood vessels to close, and there's a component in their saliva that keeps the blood vessels open and flowing. And so it looks like a little bit of a mess when you wake up. But, come back. Oh, it lasts for a little while. But no, this is the red part that dripped out. But these other stains around here are actually urine stains, because urine is not blood is not a very nutritious meal. And so within minutes of feeding, the bats begin urinating out the excess volume. And so their esophagus goes directly into their intestines to begin processing the fluid immediately. And so they have incredibly effective kidneys, and so they've been involved in studying kidney function as well for that reason. So that's a good point in the talk to bring up about the issue of bats and rabies. And I would only have done that knowing that I was fully vaccinated against any risk of transmission of rabies. And not because you assume every bat, well, you should assume every bat is potentially rabid, as you should assume every wild mammal. But although it's a very low 1 in 1,000 for healthy bats, it's still a risk, and it's essentially fatal disease if you get it. And the great risk with bats is that we all sort of think of rabid dogs and snarling rabid animals, but very often when bats succumb to rabies, they become docile. They become too weak to fly. People find them on the ground, and the bat seems like a nice little calm, helpless animal, and that's where some of the tragedies have happened. And so, but you can't tell. So just the analogy here that you can't tell by looking at them if they're infected. A lot of other things bring bats down on the ground, of course, other injuries, but they can't hurt you unless you touch them. So just don't do that or handle any wild animal without appropriate protection. All right, and anywhere that I usually go and do field work, everyone says, oh, there must be caves there, because of course that's where bats are. Well, that's one of the few places that humans and bats intersect, and so it's a natural association. But in fact, the minority, not the majority of bats occupy caves. And some of the cave bats that do occupy caves, you can find them in human structures like this. But crevice roosting, for example, is much more common. Bats have very flat bodies in one direction. I don't know if you quite see that in this light. There's a bat up in that crevice. And so rock crevices and all the sort of places where humans don't go are more often the places where bats roost. And trees especially, most of our bats that we have right around here roost up in trees and snags and the crevices behind exfoliating bark. And we've also got a lot of bats that roost right up in the leaves, in the foliage leaves. This is a photograph from a colleague of mine, Dave Wyatt, down in Sacramento City College. And he was able to radio track, captured one of these bats and radio tracked it and found a little cluster of them up in this oak tree. And so because we can't often find the places where bats go, basically anywhere that a bat can crawl into, and that can be as small as a 1/4-inch slot, Those are all places that we typically go and up high where we can't get to. So we don't often come about them or know where the roosts are. So we typically have to capture them, and then we can radio track them and meet them and have some very nice interactions with them. And we can now have tiny little radios that we can put on them, and we've learned an awful lot about their roosting habits and what they need by being able to do this, because most of us would have never gone up and looked underneath all these pieces of bark across the forest to find the few bats that are out there roosting. And we do get, this is before one of the issues that I'll discuss, that we could actually have a little more closer, intimate work with our bats. But when you capture bats, we don't like to just toss them up in the air, because a lot of them chill down metabolically, and then we'd like to give them a chance to take off. And so we let them hang out on ourselves a little bit until they're good and ready. And many of them have shown us why. Yeah, we test this theory. They don't get in your hair and get stuck, but they do camouflage, as you can see. And you can see this camouflage trick right here. And we call these hoary bats, and now you know why they have that color, of course. And sometimes they crawl all the way to the top of your head and then take a nap and stay there for a while before they take off. And I like to show some of these close-up pictures. Hopefully for some of you, you can realize that these are not gross little icky animals, right? They're warm and fuzzy and well-groomed and clean, as they have to for themselves. I'm not sure what's supposed to be here, but this is a good example of what you see when you go out to try to find bats, because they're out in the dark, we can't see them. For the most part, we can't hear them, and they're up in the air where we can't go. So this is why we don't realize how many bats are out and about there. And, oh yeah, here we go. That's what we're supposed to say. So the point of this is that we usually have to use some bit of technology to extend our own senses and know what's going on. And we've got modern tools like this, thermal imaging, that enable us to be able to see what we can't see with our own eyes and hear with our own ears. And just how bats get around the dark remained a mystery for most of human history. And, this was figured out a long time ago by Spallanzani, an Italian, who did some elegant experiments of letting bats fly around a darkened room, put wax in their ears, and realized they couldn't fly as well, and correctly reasoned the ears were involved, but he didn't quite understand just how they were using their ears. And that required the modern incarnation of vacuum tube electronics and more technology. And Don Griffin, we credit him with working out a modern understanding of echolocation. That bats, as we all know now, put out sounds, and then they listen and interpret the echoes that come back from these sounds. And to properly understand what they need, let's first understand what this does for them. This gives them the ability to roost away from vision-oriented predators, because with wings, they're very vulnerable animals, and they roost and go into different metabolic states where they're very vulnerable. But they can fly up and out and get into places where they can't be bothered. Also enables them to, as I mentioned, get into this boon of insects that are available at night. Disadvantages of this, of course, is that they make a lot of noise. And if you could hear them, people would complain about how loud they are, and probably they'd be in worse trouble than they have been historically. But a lot of moths have adapted to being able to hear bats coming. And if you've got a set of keys, next time you see some bats flying around a street light, shake your keys, and some of those moths you'll see will flutter out of the air. And those are about half the moths of the world have a simple little mechanism for picking up ultrasound and then doing a defensive maneuver. So humans like to go around saying this, but bats have just as much right going around saying deaf as a human. And the reason is that just because bats can use their hearing to orient doesn't mean that they disregard their other senses any more than you disregard your hearing because you mostly use your visual perception for getting around. And all biological organisms are going to use as much sensory input as available to better what they're doing. And when we first started listening in on bats, everyone got excited that we could do this. And because we've been doing for years, been birding by ear, but bats use their sounds differently than birds. Birds use their calls to identify themselves, and bats use them for the specific task of putting out information. And so they structure their calls and vocalizations differently. And to understand how bats use them, we need to recognize that bats are producing the sounds that they're using, so it's a limited range. And so just as when you have your own light source, things close to you are very brightly illuminated, but things far off are not. And things that you can see in great distance are not illuminated by you. You're getting passive signals from them. And bats use their vision similar to how you use a headlamp or flashlight at night, is that you'll use it for looking at close-up objects so you can't stumble into them. But to understand where you are in the landscape scale, you'll use your eyes. There's enough light that you can see the silhouettes of the distant trees or across the meadow. If you're a bat up in the air, you can see the river below you and the meadows and the line of trees to tell where you are in the landscape level. But they use your echolocation, as you do, for looking at things close up. And it gives them a little bubble of perception, but a very precise one. And they can actually tell insects ahead of them and other obstacles and pick them out. In fact, most bats do this so well, they have feeding preferences, and they can tell not just that there's a bug in front of them, but what kind of bug it is, and whether it's the kind they like or one that they should just pass by and go on to the next. So this is this is actually our smallest North American bat in the palm of my hand. It weighs just this one about 3 grams. It's about the same as a penny weighs, and it's all the parts you have in that little package. And when bats are just flying along, they will put out a series of calls that we call the search phase, and they're just sort of putting out sounds, hoping to hear an echo, or expecting or perhaps to hear an echo. And so they're searching for things, sort of trolling for what's in front of them. And at some point, if they got an echo here, then they'll start upping the repetition rate and put out more calls per second there. And then at the final conclusion, when they have found the insect and they're really going in to try to capture it, they'll put out a quick little series of calls here. And this is what we call terminal phase or a buzz. And we're listening in a bat detector, you hear the bat go right at the end when it goes after the insect. And it's just, if you had a flashlight that you could, or a headlamp or a flashlight that rather than staying on continuously, you could just press a button and flash it, you'd be okay walking along with a flash, flash, flash. But then if I threw you a ball or a frisbee, you'd go flash, 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 flash when it comes to catch you. And the bats will use their calls in just the same way. And we can sort out some of the calls by how they allocate the frequency, that is the tone of them, and the duration of them. So bats that use these long, flat calls are better for picking up objects at great distances. And these are calls you find from bats out in open air. Bats that are flying in around what we call clutter will sweep through more frequencies and get more precise timing information back and more information about the objects by going through a range of frequencies. And with that understanding, we can interpret a lot of the ecological and foraging behaviors of bats just by looking at the calls that they're doing. And so some of my work that I've been involved in is looking at these calls in detail and being able to work out ways that we can be able to tell and identify these different species apart just by listening in on them. And that gives us a non-invasive tool for being able to go out in the environment and just assess what bats are there and give us some notion of who's there and about how many are there. And to work out these methods, myself and my graduate students have gone out. Previously we had to capture the bats and then track them to be able to know just what kind of bat makes what kind of a sound. And so various ways we've done this. One way is attaching them on this is an elastic sewing thread, a little mini bungee, and we get them to fly along a zip line here and stand along the side, and we can record the calls from them as they go by and then release them afterwards. And I tried this with a vampire bat one time. Though, and here he is ready to fly, and like any good bat, you hold them up when you're ready and you let them go. And I was quite surprised because the bat just dropped down to the ground and took off running. Because as you saw, they're quite good at crawling around. And it really surprised me because I didn't know what happened. It happened very quickly. It dropped down, and then that elastic line is snapping back into my face, and I didn't know if there was a bat attached to it. But we can get better quality and longer duration recordings when they're really out underway by attaching little light tags to them after we catch them here. And here we are attaching a little mini siloom stick to this bat. And then we release it. and fly it away, and that enables us to track it visually, and then when it comes by your microphone, you know what bat it is from the ones that you've released, and then we can track them like this. This is a bat taking off here, and you can actually see the breaks in the beam here where the wings come down and interrupt the light. Okay, there we go. All right, so getting into some of the other issues here that's been happening with bats. We all are after green energy and nice carbon low thing, but there's been a risk of putting these large things up in the air in terms of what they do to the bats. And so this emerged about the middle 2000s, where they started having a lot of installations of wind energy back on the eastern part of the United States. And suddenly we started finding a lot of bat carcasses underneath these turbines and looked at what was going on. And this first came out in these facilities here in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And I have to note the scale on here. This is, it's a second growth eastern hardwood forest, but look at how big these are compared to the forest. And so there's multiple things going on that's bringing this. But just as bats use their visual clues to see what's ahead of them and get a landscape perspective, a lot of bats will key in on tall snags as a potential place to go and roost, or even just a short break when they're out foraging. And one of the things we believe is going on is that these tall towers fit their search image for a tall, prominent snag and are attracted to them. And the tree roosting bats are killed more often than the other types of bats, and so that's consistent with that notion. And this is what, of course, a snag would look like, a natural snag, but these fit that, looking for the tall, prominent snags that many of the species do. And this issue first came to light at this facility here, and in which there were a large number of carcasses being found. It was coming out to about one per night per turbine, thereabouts, on these. And so we first started looking at what's going on. Are these turbines making sounds that are attracting the bats? And no, that didn't seem to be the case. And we realized this counterintuitive effect that you might expect, as the wind's blowing faster, that more bats would get killed. And it turns out, no, it's just the opposite. That as the wind speed increases, less bats are killed. And these things don't go any slower or faster when the wind picks up. They just adjust their pitch so they extract more or less energy from the wind. So they're all going around at the same speed. And this negative correlation comes about that when the wind is really blowing hard, the bats aren't getting high enough off the ground to get in harm's way. And because they'll just get blown out of their local area if they do. So it's only when the winds are blowing light that they get up high enough to get in the way. And so this has enabled one mitigation approach, which is to, rather than starting these things turning at these low wind speeds when they're not producing that much energy, instead don't start letting them turn until the wind speeds get high. And just upping what is called the cut-in speed to a moderate level here, you can save 50 to 90% of the bats that would otherwise get killed at these facilities. And it seems like a pretty sensible thing to do. And it only represents 2% loss of energy. But if you're looking from the industry side, that's quite a bit of money in there. And so there's been working out hybrid solutions that when it seems to be a greater risk for bats, then they can follow some of these. So this gives us one tool that we can use. And so what's actually getting them there, what's hitting them, is we recognize that large objects like this moving at biologically unnatural speeds can lead to impacts with the bats. And that's a little exaggerated, but many of you have probably experienced hitting one of these animals or birds in there. And you take something that's 3 times the size of this vehicle and actually moving at 3 times the speed, because these look like they're going slow in the distance, but up at the tip, they're going over 180 miles an hour. And so bats, even with their echolocation and everything, if they're up there flying through that rotor swept zone, they just can't anticipate and see something or detect that blade coming to them. And so if they're up there, they're likely to get hit. And so we've moved toward pre-assessing these facilities before they go in to see if there are perhaps migratory routes going through here. Because we don't know with the bats, as we do with birds, where potential migratory routes lie. So we look to do a pre-assessment. And so when they put up the meteorological towers for potential sites, we also do bat monitoring on them to try to see over a calendar year if there's any migratory activity up there. And this is, these are some local up here. And no, that's not a bat, that's a moth. And we can also do some assessment from the operating ones to see how this is going and to assess the risk and potentially use this to shut down these systems if we get detections for bats. So some of the other work that we've done is to look at, well, is there anything else we can do to keep the bats away from these turbines? And so can we create sounds, understanding how bats use their echolocation, can we create sounds that keeps the bats out of harm's way? And so this is some work that we started mid-2000s, and we hoped that we might be able to create a no-fly zone around these turbines. So create a sort of a bat deterrent device. And this is actually out in Nebraska, and we had to go out in Nebraska to get to this model turbine to test it, because this is the same model turbine that was killing all those bats in West Virginia. But after that first year of study where they're killing all the bats, they wouldn't let us back on the facility. And so we actually had to go out to Nebraska to get the same turbines to do some testing. And so we started doing some first on-the-ground testing of broadcasting sounds to see what effect it would be for the bats. And turned out some really remarkable control versus experimental results of being able to keep the bats away when we had the soundscape operating. And then we later took this and did, just a couple years ago, completed a test of actually implementing these up on a series of turbines in Pennsylvania. And you can see them up there operating. And we were able to get, and this paper just came out earlier this year in PLS 1, and we were able to get about a 50% reduction in mortality when we broadcast the sounds from here. So this is another thing that's moving on implementing between the cut-in mitigation and timing of the operation and potentially broadcasting these deterrent sounds gives us some approach at being able to reduce the risk to bats. Now, the limitation of using that technique, the broadcasting the sound on turbines, comes from the fact that the ultrasound, the high frequencies that you have to broadcast, don't really travel that far in the air, and they attenuate quickly. And so we can cover sort of the inside part of the turbine, which seems to be effective because most of the bats are going toward the tower part of it. But that led to another application. This is a local application here. These are yeah, look at this. This is a temporary bridge along Highway 169 inland from here that during the 1964 Klamath River flood, these bridges were taken out and they put in temporary bridges. And just a couple years ago did they get around to replacing these temporary bridges from 1964. But in the intervening years, bats had gone in, and because of the wooden structure of these bridges, bats were roosting on these bridges. And before you take down demolish a bridge and there's bats roosting on it, you have to get them off. And it turned out to be a complicated situation here because of the multiple cavities of this old wooden structures. And so we realized that was a good application for this acoustic deterrent technology that we're applying on the turbines. And we, in fact, set this system up. And here's one of the broadcasting devices here. And we began operating it at the tail end of winter before the bats came back in the spring to keep the bats off the bridge from reoccupying it that spring so that they could take the bridge down. And of course, you would not want to just take the bridge down and lose that roost. And so I was able to work with Caltrans and have them install on the replacement bridge a bat roost device, which is this extra component that was attached to the bottom of the bridge to put a crevice in there of the kind the bats like to roost in. And this is pictures from earlier this year where the bats have reoccupied this and In fact, now it seems to be in higher numbers than were previous on the bridge. And it's good news to see that you can do something like this and actually bring them back. And if you look up in there closely, you can see all the little heads and faces all up in there, lined up in there, looking at you. Now, my earlier work was looking in the physiology of bats, and what really fascinated me was that they could go through these extremes of metabolism from flight, which is the highest powered, most highly metabolic activity that any mammal does. If you don't believe that, go out and try it yourself. To these very low metabolic states that bats do when they're hibernating, what we call a physiological state of torpor, great reduction in heart rate and body temperature to reduce metabolism to make it through winter. And if you look at your, what we call metabolic scope between when you're at rest here, and even more than you are here when you're sleeping, to running as hard as you can, your change in metabolic rate is about 7 to 10. And for this animal, between these two states, it's on the order of over 1,000 times different. And it's the mechanical equivalent of trying to get I hope I'm not hitting anyone in the eye with that. Yeah, there we go. Of getting a small car to operate with a large jet engine efficiently. And of course, the animal has to be efficient at both of these states. And when I thought of that analogy, I also realized that the bats had actually we had made a device like that, but we borrowed the technology from the bats. But it's part of my work of figuring this out. One of the things that I learned was that when bats are in that very low state of metabolism, one of the ways that they save energy and make that reduction is they can go for very long periods of time without breathing and actually passively acquire oxygen. And I just want to show you this bit of data here, and this is the world record apnea, which means a period without breathing. So anytime if you ever see a bat that's hibernating or just hanging at rest, which is likely to be in torpor, and you look at it, and we tell animals are alive when they're breathing, but you might have to wait a very long time to actually see them breathe. And this is the longest period that I measured, which is 2.5 hours without breathing before they actually take a breath in here. And that's by virtue because they're so small, they can passively absorb oxygen down their trachea. Yeah. It's a diffusion and convection process. So and you can't do that because you're so big, but because the distance from a bat's nose to its lungs is that far, it actually can make it work. And also because when they're in torpor, their metabolic demand for oxygen is so very low that they can actually support it with this passive influx of oxygen. And ultimately, when they finally do breathe, it's not because they need the oxygen. It's because they have to get rid of the CO2 that builds up. Yeah. Now, from those studies, we're also able to measure how much oxygen and metabolic activity they have when they're at these cold body temperatures in torpor. And if you calculate how long they could go, so a bat would go into hibernation, a medium-sized bat would go into hibernation with about 10 grams of fat, about like a pat of butter you would get for your biscuit. And when you look at the measured rate of metabolism at that state, and the calories that are in that's 10 grams of fat to carry in, they should be able to go for over 4 years at that condition. But we know that they can barely make it through a winter hibernation. And so what's going on? Well, these animals don't stay, excuse me, all hibernators go through periodic bouts of arousal over the course of a winter. And so they'll be in torpor, this low metabolic state, and then they'll arouse, and then they'll go back into torpor. And bats, it may be weeks when they're in torpor, 2, 3, even up to 4 weeks in torpor, but they ultimately have to arouse. And the reasons for those arousals is it's just basically house cleaning. It's a very low state of metabolism, but they are still developing metabolic waste products that they need to eliminate. And when they're in torpor, their liver's not really functioning, their kidneys aren't functioning, so they basically have to wake up, warm up their bodies, and in fact, they actually have to go to sleep because they're getting sleep deprived in this state. It's a different physiological state than sleep. And so you have to periodically go through these. And it's these arousals that turns out to be the most expensive part of hibernation in terms of metabolism. So if you look at a model 6-month winter here, that the animal goes through bouts of torpor followed by arousals, bouts of torpor followed through arousals. And these arousals are very expensive. And more than 80% of the metabolic energy in that fat that they carry into hibernation. And think about what a bat has to do too here. So if you think of a hibernating animal like a marmot, they can eat all summer long and get just as fat as they possibly can and sort of waddle into their burrow and do it. But a bat, as a flying animal, has a payload restriction. They can only put on so much fat and up to the point that they can haul it into them and fly into their hibernaculum with them. And so they're on a very tight energy budget. And because these arousals are so expensive, and if a bat is disturbed during its hibernation, that will elicit other arousals. And so this has been, for long term, one of the main conservation problem with bats is human disturbance in their hibernacula. So these are talking about bats that go into deep cavern systems to spend the winter. And all of natural history, they've been undisturbed. And so they're very sensitive to disturbance. And once humans came around, light sources that could go into those spaces, that would disturb them. And so many of our federally listed species are cave roosting bats of this type because of winter hibernation disturbance. So if they're disturbed, that will elicit an arousal so they can come up and be ready to respond. But taking that little cold puddle of water of the body mass of the bat and raising that up to warm body temperature, that is a lot of caloric expenditure. And so the threat would pass, even if it's non-malicious, and they will go back into torpor. But too many unanticipated arousals over the course of a winter will lead to more arousals, and they'll just starve. They'll run out of energy throughout and not make it through a winter. And so a lot of the previous conservation measures have been to install elaborate gating systems on many of these important hibernacula to let the bats freely pass through them, but to keep people out. And that's proven to be a quite good strategy until another recent problem. And this other recent problem emerged in the middle 2000s, and it first was found up here in Howe Cavern in upstate New York. And it emerged from there, and it has since spread, and I'm talking about white nose syndrome. And this is an emergent fungal disease that's affecting bats and killing them in huge numbers in the northeastern part of North America. And it's steadily been progressing westward. And now we're all the way out into Oklahoma and Missouri, and we're not sure yet what's going to happen. But it first came out here in Howe Caverns, upstate New York. That's a commercial cave. A couple 100,000 people a year go into there. And our best suspicion is that somebody was visiting a cave somewhere in the old world, and within days, and not until we had modern inventions like airplanes could somebody be in an obscure subterranean space on one continent, and within a few days later deposit spores into another obscure subterranean location on another continent on the planet. And that has now led to this. And it's a situation where what's happening is the outward signs are these fungal growths on the exposed tissues. It's a cryophilic fungus. It's a member of a group of soil fungi that's they thrive at very cold temperatures. And so when the bats are in torpor and their body temperatures are cold, that's when the fungus progresses, and ultimately the hyphae get into their tissues, it irritates them, and that elicits another arousal. And then too many cycles of this again over the course of a winter hibernation, and they just run out of energy. And this was first observed. This is one of the classic photos when this was first found, but it was first observed by Al Hicks, a biologist in New York State, who routinely for many decades had been observing these hibernating colonies to take a population count on them. On approaching some of the caves that he'd been going to for years, first noticed this. And what you see scattered on the ground here are bits and pieces of bats that upon starvation were in desperation leaving the hibernaculum, that is the cave roost, and attempting to forage and feed. But in the dead of winter, an insect-feeding bat is not going to get very far. and be successful. And if you look closely, you can see some bits of wings there and actual full-on carcass here. And so this was his first observation before he went in and then started seeing the bats with the visible signs. And in many locations, it's 99% to 100% of these species that are succumbing to this. And we now have emergency listing status heading for what used to be one of the most, or the most common species in eastern North America. And just a couple weeks ago, one of the other species has been put up for listing as well that's suffering from this. So we like it when we can see wildlife in abundance, and anytime that you can, it's really fabulous. But we have to play our part to help these animals along, and they're beneficial, and they do us well, and we can live peacefully with them. We just have to know what they need and help them to do what they need. This is a site of a roost emergence actually coming off of a bridge in Texas, but you can see a similar site as this in California just on the interstate that goes between Davis and Sacramento, and the wildlife group down there that can put you in contact to be able to see an emergence like this down there. And I think that's about where we want to be for that. Yep. So you can put that last slide up if you want, but I can take questions or. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's been a very, very difficult thing because when the bats come up to a warm body temperature, the fungus dies back. And, but they don't have the metabolic resources to stay warm. And you can't feed thousands and thousands of bats over time. Are we okay with a few minutes? Okay. Yeah. So there's, and likewise, you don't want to go in and just fumigate these caves with fungicide because there's all kinds of other things going on in the natural state of these caves, other parts of ecology, microbiology, and all that's going on in there to do this. And so, this has been a very, very bad thing. There's some indication in the last year that some of the populations we think might be rebounding from this, but we don't know if those are just naive bats moving into the area yet. The story's still not worked out. Yes?
On the wind turbines, are the manufacturers open to using the stuff that you come up with?
It's improving. Yeah, it's improving. We just had we've got a consortium with a number of manufacturers that are keen on doing this and are now working with us and other biologists to implement some of these changes to make it go. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, they like this technique with broadcasting sound. From an industry viewpoint, they prefer that because of changing the cut-in speed where they're actually losing income from the turbines. They would like us to be able to just give them something they can pay for at once and it solves the problem. But it's not going to completely solve it, but it's going to help. So they're in favor of that sort of a solution.
Are they doing that voluntarily?
Let's say they're getting sufficient encouragement to do it. And it varies from company to company. So there are some companies where they have sort of a corporate attitude of, we really want to do this right. And so those are the first ones that have been most helpful with working with and addressing this problem. But ultimately, we hope, and it's one of these things where, particularly if it's a publicly held company, then it's what we all can do to help encourage them to do this properly.
Are they all part of new applications often, so they want to public relations for existing installations, but it would also be part of the new applications?
Yeah. And then when they're doing the right things like this too, they can promote that and spin it. If they're going to say that they're doing green energy, then let's do it. Let's do the full Monty on it. Yeah.
Do you see this syndrome making it to the West Coast?
Well, yeah, there's natural barriers, and when I mentioned, I showed some of those early pictures where we're handling the bats, and we had them right on us. We don't do that anymore. Since this emerged, we all follow decontamination protocols where we only handle the bats with a new fresh glove, and we sterilize our equipment in between, hands and all. And so we've been trying to not have humans again contribute to the spread of this across. And so far that the human role in it seems to be not contributing, but it's been this steady progression that makes it look as though the bats themselves are the vectors that are moving it steadily. And it's about in the middle of the country now. We don't know how far it's going to go. Our one best hope is that there's actually a different roosting and hibernation behavior and ecology in the western part of the United States than the eastern. And the situation that was ripe for this to happen in eastern North America followed from the fact that these bats hibernated in huge groups, hundreds of thousands in some situations altogether, but thousands together in these hibernaculum. And a lot of disease ecology relates to population density. And so you have this huge population density of them, which made it ripe for something like this to happen. And out west, we don't have that. All of our bats out west only hibernate in much smaller clusters, up maybe to a few hundred. And that's a large hibernating group of bats in the western United States. So we're hoping that the more dispersed habits of that will help. And there's some forensic evidence that bats in Europe, where we think this came from, once did similarly hibernate in very large groups. They no longer do. And that may have been their adjustment. So we don't think that these bats are going to go to extinction, but they're going to be probably forever, I mean the ones in the east, probably forever in lower numbers now that we've done this. Yeah?
Did you see any indication of bats learning about the dangers of wind generators on their own?
I don't, yeah.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. He asked if we've seen any indication of the bats actually learning to avoid the towers on their own. And we've not been able to track them effectively, I think, to really tell that. But for example, with this acoustic deterrent technology, we're hoping that the bats will learn because that effective sound, the physiologically effective soundscape that we can create is only on the interior of the rotor swept area. But what we hope is that if any of the bats experience that, they'll be able to hear it at a much greater distance outside the rotor swept area, that on subsequent approaches to such a situation, they'll know, I don't want to go there. So we hope that it'll serve as a learned acoustic beacon, so to speak, on that. But no, themselves, we don't know. Yeah, probably some of the bats that have made it in there and without a direct hit and had a bad experience, they're very quite good at learning. That's one of the problems with misnetting and capturing bats, is you really can't do mark recapture studies with bats because they're so good at learning that obstacle is there and they'll avoid it after. You can't recapture them. So they probably, the ones that survive, they probably learn to avoid. Yeah, that would be my suspicion. Yeah, in the back.
You were saying that they don't hibernate in as big groups anymore. Does that have anything to do with an increase or a decrease in the spreading of the fungus?
Yeah, the question was that these ones that we said, well, it's in Europe where we've seen that they don't hibernate in large groups anymore. And so that's the speculation, is that those bats in Europe previously have experienced this, because we have since found that fungus is present in Europe in the old world bats that are over there. And so we think that is part of their, it just has reached this equilibrium level at which the bats can get along with living with this fungus, because it doesn't become as much of an issue because they have now a more dispersed population. So we don't have the evidence yet, but that may happen in eastern North America, that those bat populations will survive, but we'll only now see dozens at a time hibernating, or maybe 100 or two, but never thousands of them anymore like we had previously. Well, at that point, once you get down to a lower population density, then we would expect the disease not to spread as fast. Yeah. And that's what we hope. Once it gets further west here, it won't spread as fast in the west as it happened in the east, because we already don't have those large groups that hibernate together. Yeah, keep your fingers crossed, because everything that we've hoped for with this to date has not turned out to be. Yeah, one more over there. How did they involve the adaptation for echolocation? Very good question. And well, I'll tell you, it's something you can do yourself. So we think of it as something that's exclusive to bats and this marvelous thing, but you can learn it, you can train yourself to echolocate. So it's well within our ability. If you make clicking noises, and if you wave something in front of your face with your eyes closed, you can tell if something's there or not. And so that at least gives you a little bit of an impression of what the bats are doing. And so they probably started doing something very crude and simple like that, and then just kept selecting to have it better and better.
I've worked at wind turbine facilities looking at fatalities, mainly on raptors. We did have some bat fatalities. Most of them were intact. And at the time, there was the discussion about it being a pressure gradient.
Yeah. So there's been these observations of many bats found. The mortality searches at turbines have found bats that seem to be intact. And so Robert Barkley and his group came up with a hypothesis of what's called barotrauma, which is the suspicion that the bats would get caught in the low-pressure vortex, the aerodynamic vortex off the turbines, and sort of have an explosive decompression in their lungs. And in fact, they had evidence for that, showing that the pulmonary capillaries showed evidence of bleeding, which is consistent with that. And that has since been disputed, and or it's argued that you can get that same effect just from blunt trauma, that the bats are so small that if they just strike the broad area surface of the turbine just so, that you're not necessarily going to get broken bones, but you're going to have a real large hydrostatic impact. The fluids in the bat are going to suddenly have a large spike in pressure, and that will manifest itself by blowing out the capillaries in the lungs, because that's where you have the most fragile fluid to air interface in the system. So whether it's exactly from barotrauma or from direct impact is rather moot. But it's from close interaction with the rotors on the turbines. So the turbines are killing them. And at first it was thought that, well, maybe the bats are just flying into these towers, and it's not because they're moving. And that first study that we did in the Mountaineer facility, there were, I think, 44 turbines, and they all had fatalities on them, except for the one. And the one had no fatalities, because that was the one that was non-operational during the study. So right there, that was good evidence that, no, it's the spinning rotors that's getting them. Yeah.
I have a question about the acoustic
Yeah.
traction extension. Have you tested that on lots of different varieties of bats? Does it seem like it's going to be a pretty widespread application? And what sort of
No, yeah, it's still, yeah, it still have only done testing with it in North America, and there's some groups planning on doing some testing elsewhere. But the basic notion of that, it should be effective on any echolocating bat, but not, of course, a visually orienting bat. And it would be similar to having a very bright light shining at you, and you would just be disoriented and wouldn't be able to see anything more from that. And you'd probably like to go away from it.
Is the cost low enough that it's pretty much a rounding error?
Yeah. It's a very, very small part of the cost of these turbines cost $1 million, and it's $10,000-$20,000 to equip it with one of these systems, and it's also very low power. I mean, these are generating megawatts, and it takes the order of 100 watts or so to run one of these, so it's not that big of an energy drain either. Yeah. So the biggest problem with it is just maintenance that you would have to, on some annual schedule, probably replace some of the transducer elements, the speaker elements in them and all. But you have to change light bulbs too.